everyone, welcome back from the break. Hope you had time to have a little leg stretch and a breather. We're heading into quite a juicy session next. It's called Examining Power and Privilege in International Development. And we have got Soha, who is our board co-chair, to chair this session. So I won't give too much away. I will just hand over to you, Soha.
Thank you, Della. Just checking if our speakers are on.
Yes, I can see Guppi and Kékéli. Welcome.
Great. Thank you, Della. So a quick introduction about myself. So I've been a trustee with Results UK for the last 3 years, and as Della said, recently taken over the co-chair position within the board. And I've worked within the international development sector with a focus on economic development for the last decade. I would really like to thank Results for giving me the honor to chair a session on a topic that in an hour we could only scratch the surface: examining power and privilege in the international development sector. How is power and privilege entrenched in the history of international development, and how do those imbalances manifest in the lives of people living in poverty today? In the last decade of working in the sector, I have seen power and privilege manifest in different ways. I would like to take a moment to share some of the dichotomies in which power and privilege could be viewed. Firstly, we've got the developed versus developing countries. More recently, this is known as North versus South. You know, those who colonize versus those who are colonized. The second is kind of donor versus beneficiaries or recipients. Now, this is a big driver of power, as donors are determining how success is defined and control the purse string. Let's not even go into the debate of the usage of the word beneficiary. Then we have headquarters versus field office, where decisions are being made versus where things need to be executed. One that's quite common, international versus local expertise. Often there is an emphasis on international experts versus strong local knowledge. And to add to that, there is also a pay differential between international and local experts. Then we have the usual kind of dichotomies where, you know, white versus non-white, or person of color, or Black, Asian, minority ethnic, better known as BAME, male versus female, old versus young, heterosexual versus non-heterosexual. Now, research shows that it only takes a few seconds to make an impression. And if there is a strong bias based on the dichotomies presented, then a person who is male, gray-haired, white, and from a developed country has inherently more power and privilege over others, only at the first impression. Now, obviously, I'm exaggerating, but on that note, I would like to open the session to discuss what can campaigners and advocates do now to ensure that they are dismantling rather than upholding racism and oppression. We have two amazing speakers today, Kékéli Kpognon and Guppi Bola. I will introduce them in that order and then ask them a few questions, which they have pre-prepared answers for. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box. We will come to the questions in the last 15 minutes. Now, part one with Kékéli, we're looking at how power and privilege is entrenched in the history of international development. Kékéli, a bit of bio about Kékéli, then we'll go into the questions. Kékéli has an academic background in migration, mobility, and development, and has worked for the past 15 years, mostly in African-led organizations, NGOs, and platforms in Europe and Africa. She has extensively worked in social norms, social change, and movement building. The common thread of Kékéli's work is the promoting of an intersectional perspective to development and human rights, and advocating for people-centered policy and beneficiaries-led practice. Now, the first question for Kékéli is, could you tell us a bit more about what motivates you to do the work that you're doing?
Hello, and hi, everybody. Greetings from Brussels. To answer your question, there's only one word: is responsibility. What pushes me is the responsibility to contribute to making the life of people who look like me better. And that sense of responsibility comes from realizing my own position of privilege in the world. And that privilege came to me by accident of birth. And it was luck that made me being born in a comfortable family, educated parents. So it's not so much my merit, as great as I might think I am, but it is really, I want to stress the fact that luck has a lot to do with our life circumstances, and that's something that should not be underplayed. There's also something that pushes me is my upbringing and growing up, where the norms around me is stress the importance of the collective, that I am here because others have been here before me. So it is my responsibility to ensure that I contribute to whoever comes after me. So, and also our lives are very interconnected. So I situate myself within a collective, and within that collective, I feel I have to contribute.
Thank you. That's great. And people like us at the conference who are interested in ending poverty and international development will likely have heard criticisms about failings to address structural racism and colonialism. Could you unpack this for us?
Right. It is something that we could have spent hours on, and I'll try to be as succinct as possible. I think the question that not enough people ask is where international development really comes from. But the same people have no issue asking me when I am working, oh, but where do you really come from? So I like to return the question. For me, the two questions are linked, because it is about the idea that development is a white preserve, and in a way, you talk about beneficiary, I look like a beneficiary, so what am I doing here? I think the way international development has been practiced is, one of the aims is to bring progress, Western defined modernity to the rest of the world. But where does European modernity comes from? Where does it really come from? And that's where things start becoming possibly a bit less savory. We talk about the Industrial Revolution. That Industrial Revolution was possible only because of the capital accumulated during the transatlantic slave trades. And many people do not know that history, or is something that is erased or disappears from storybooks. And again, another aspect of how the Industrial Revolution was sustained, it was labor from colonial empires. So that's where, again, those connections are there as a guiding thread. And when we look at the origins of this inception of international development, it was after the Second World War, but still in an area of empire. And again, that is something that is overlooked, forgotten, or not in the official origin stories of international development, but very much infused with colonial and racist ideas of the white man's burden to bring civilizations and the legacy of enlightenment to the heart of darkness. And these are words that we hear a lot, and but when you put all of them together in a sentence, then it becomes a little bit more puzzling. And again, in that post-World War II, still empire world, but growing calls of independence from the colonies, some of the thinking was, how can you prepare an exit strategy from the state of the world in 1949 or early 50s, and how, and after centuries of exploitation, oppression, how can we mitigate, how can we take control of that part of common history, of the narrative? So the idea that we will help you develop after, I guess, having underdeveloped you for so long. And we are here to, the sense of development to development in Western European terms, to revert from going back to whatever stage is the formerly colonized countries were before they were found by by Europeans. And in all of that, the assumption of developing countries or less advanced, as it used to be, very loaded terms, the question of who saves, who gives development, and the default of that, the answer being white people, was never questioned. Those conversations are coming now. So what, I think to wrap up, until more development practitioners engage with the complete origin story, the sector as a whole will continue to perpetuate some racist ideas of how the world should be. And it also, I mean, development progress is the idea that the whole world should live according to the rule of the former master. And I think this is a question that we don't ask enough.
Thank you. Thank you, Kékéli. So could you give us then a few examples of what makes a development program either reinforcing this imbalance or help to make it fairer?
I will try to not dwell on the things that make the sector unbalanced, unfair. There's a lot of unwritten rule. There is a culture of development, and for people who haven't been socialized in a certain way, it's very difficult to get access. So which degree from which university, for example, the rule across the sector, quite widely spread, of not disclosing salaries, for example, which means that unless you are ready to take the risk, unless there is some level of cushioning, then it's very difficult for people of color to get into a hiring process when there's so much uncertainty. It's a chance that many do not want to take. And once they are in the sector, is the issue of how they've been treated. The people with lived experience, in addition to technical expertise, being told that they are not objective enough, they're too close to the topic to be impartial, as if partiality in the sector is something that, or anywhere else, is something that exists. I think funding is an issue. The sector favors big organizations. Small organizations, the ones that are user-led, tend to struggle because there is a lack of trust, institutional, I would call it institutional racism in the funding ecosystem, the way some organizations are seen to belong to a certain place. So if you are, I'll take the African-led organization. Oh, but I've been told so many times, oh, but there's something beautiful in you being small, and we don't have the capacity. We don't have the capacity to grow. I think this is something that have come, but at the same time, a lot of things, a lot of practices are happening to change the world of development. So for example, there is the African Women Development Fund. It's a fund, it's set up by a bunch of African women a number of years ago, and they have lived the experience of the organization that they are financing. They know the context because they are not in headquarters or somewhere far removed from the field. So the combination of expertise, knowledge, and being with the grantees is something that's making a lot of difference on the continent, because it means funding that is tailored to the organization rather than organization having to rejig to fit the priorities of a donor. I will also take Forward, which is an organization I've worked with, working on child marriage, sexual and reproductive health. And one of the way, and it's an African women-led organization, and one of the way they work is that before they start the project, they will go and ask. It's even before the project is written, what is the need? How can we support? And then there've been cases where it had meant going back to drawing board and say, oh, we wanted to work on these issues, but actually the people are telling us this is marginal. It might be at the top of our priorities, but for their life, this is marginal. And having the flexibility to tailor programs or to challenge their own assumptions. And there's a lot of organizations like that who have a a different attitude, but I think most of them can be found in the global south. And again, because of the way the sector is, it's difficult to hear about their work because they focus on the doing rather than the telling.
Thank you. Going back to in terms of, so the next question is around kind of language. And my question is, how do language and images contribute to the unequal power relations between donor countries, i.e. the global north, and implementing countries in the global south?
I think language is very, very loaded, and sometimes language and images are used to, I mean, there's been talk of poverty porn in the sector, either that or pictures of smiling children and women, and that and it equates to success. It makes the people at the receiving end jump through and jump to the happy end of the development process. Oh, look, if you give money, or if those people do that, then oh, they're all happy, it works. And there's something quite emotive and a little bit manipulative in there, but it goes to, and it shows people with very little agency. It's, for example, you talk about beneficiary. This is a term that clearly indicates where the power lies. They are people at the mercy of goodwill, rather than I guess real people. It cultivates that sense of helplessness. There's also, and if people are not beneficiary, then they become targets. And the etymology of the word lies in the military world, and it's a target is something to be hit at. It's something that's not fully human, and the language participates to dehumanize a lot of the so-called beneficiary people in receiving countries. And sometimes I feel like instead of talking about developing country, we should just call them what they are, formerly colonized country, because in a way it would just spill it out and get straight to how to how did we get to the state we are now. And the last thing is silence is language in the development sector can be used to silence. There's a lot of oh, if you find the right frame, we will solve issues. Frame that simplify, reduce, essentialize, because or apparently the wider public does not like complexity. I would say anybody who watches soap opera is ready for complexity and understanding how inequality have come to be. But it also means that's focused on positive communication, hope-based communication, also mean that whenever I or people like me try to present an alternative, it's seen as a critique. It's seen as, oh, angry people coming in a way to rain on a parade. So it's a very, language is a powerful weapon all around, whether it's within how between practitioners we use it, but also in how it depicts a whole bunch of people and strip them from their humanity, their individuality, because in a way, beneficiary targets are all a bunch of individual, and then they turn into those people.
Thank you. I guess my last question then for this part is, with the Quaker Council for European Affairs, who you're in touch with, you've been part of many discussions and webinars with experts on these issues around power. Do you have any particular ideas or thoughts on the most important thing that we can collectively do now?
I think the first thing I would say, it's about managing our expectations, because change takes time. Unlearning takes time, but we are in the world of short funding cycle where we're supposed to show results for ending poverty within 18, 24, 36 months. So that's one thing that it's about resilience, because we are in for the long fight, and I know that I will not see the efforts of the work I am doing now to to change the status quo, but it is about contribution. And then I would say, know your power. It's about, as I said, learning about the origin of the industry, the long history that goes back all the way to the time of empire and slavery. It is about learning, understanding the privileges associated with our position. And we can't pretend that we do not have power, that's, oh, we're all equal. At some point in the future we will be, but at this moment in time, this is not the situation, and pretending that it isn't so is not helpful. The next step then is to manage that power. What is our role in the development world? Whose agenda are we pushing? How do we behave with the power that we have? Where is our place in the collective? Is it the assumption that we're here to lead? Robert Chambers is a well-known development practitioner and an academic, and he talks about the power to empower. And it's something, and by that he means how some of us, and I think groups like Result have that power to convene people, to create reflection spaces, so that people can come and draw their own conclusion, look at the bigger picture, but also take a sit back and listen. And there is power in that. I firmly believe that there is a role for mainstream organizations, but the question is it to lead, or is it to create an environment that enables those most affected to achieve the change that they want, rather than what we think is best for them? And in turn, to finish, the question I would ask all of you is what is your understanding of international development? And if it's something along the line that it's about working for a world where wherever we are, we can all live with dignity, in safety, and in a way that sustains the environment around us, then it's not just about there, but it's also here that we need to continue to develop.
Thank you, Kékéli. Those are really, really useful insights. And I wanted to pick up on your word dignity. I think that came across quite often. I think Aaron said it in his opening statement yesterday. The work that Results does is sort of centered around everyone having dignity. And I think that's quite an important to sort of note that in terms of working in such departments. So thank you. I've seen a few sort of questions come through the chat, but let's hold off on that because I want to go to our second speaker, who is Guppi, and we kind of start off the next session before I go to the question. So the next part is around what can campaigners and advocates do now to ensure that they are dismantling rather than upholding racism and oppression, with Guppi. So a bit of introduction about Guppi. She's a consultant strategist focused on building an economic democracy that centers on racial justice. She is the co-founder of Decolonising Economics, working on our power in resourcing racial justice, projects designed to build the political power of people of color. She has an academic background in public health, which she uses to focus the strategic thinking on the root causes of social inequality and ill health. Guppi applies this expertise to design intersectional policy and campaigns that would help us move towards a just transition. All right, first question to Guppi. What has inspired you into campaigning and what continues to give you energy? Is your vision, purpose for the work that you do?
Thanks very much. Thank you so much for being on your computers on such a beautiful day and yeah, sticking with us into the afternoon. I'm really impressed. So hopefully, yeah, we'll have a really great chat in the next half an hour or so. So I see my journey over the last decade, I think in sort of 3 phases. So as Soha mentioned, I have a background in public health, and what kind of drove me into campaigning was actually beginning medical school and then failing my first year. I thought I wanted to become a doctor because I had a real interest in the science of the body that came through my father wasn't a doctor, he worked in pharmaceuticals. So I always had this sort of scientific fascination, but I very quickly became political when I realized that there were things that were making people ill that were outside of their control. And that has basically been the question that has stayed with me since I was maybe 18 or 19, is to answer that question. So through looking at patterns of diseases and sickness in the UK and across the world, why was it that it was evident you could predict groups of people of color, groups of women, trans people, disabled people?
Guppi, I think you've gone on mute.
Yes, I have gone on mute.
At the point of disabled people.
Disabled people, yeah, are more likely to show up with ill health or more likely to die than those who are cis, so born and remain the gender that they were born with, or straight or white. And why is that comparison existing, and why does that create structural inequalities? So I spent most of my time in my early years also working for Oxfam, trying to answer that question, and basically looking at, trying to identify what the root causes of ill health were. And that question took a whole different level while I was at Oxfam, because also at 2011, my grandfather passed away. And for me, my personal experience with my grandfather was, I didn't speak Punjabi. I don't speak Punjabi still. So I have a very distant relationship with my grandparents. And there was a generational divide in our family for those who moved over in the 50s and 60s to those of us who were born here, like me, that a real disconnect in our history. The history of partition was never talked about. So in his death, I began to question a lot more about what my relationship was with him, and learned a lot more about him through his diaries, which he had left in his office, and that we spent quite a lot of time reading through his papers, looking through his photos, and trying to discover who he was. And that really just opened up this whole history of partition that my family were involved in, that no one ever spoke about, but was such a big politicizer for me in understanding what it means for me to be a British citizen with an Indian heritage, to come from Punjab, to not speak Punjabi because my dad wanted us to grow up knowing English and only English because of the experience he had of racism when he came to the UK in the 60s. And what that did in creating a disconnect between me and my family members, and continues to, even though I'm also married to someone who is an Indian citizen and who's now moved over here to live with me. So it's really, the questions I had became very personal, I guess. And then I started to see things in a very different way. So I began to more deeply understand my personal experience within the development sector, particularly in Oxfam, but also within the climate movement, around assumptions that people had around what it meant for me to be a person of colour. And that soon moved me, I'm just going to move quickly into the next phase, that soon moved me to look more at, as I mentioned, the root causes and systems. So I got really basically compelled by the economy and what the economy was doing. Of course, 2011 was the financial crisis, so I was looking into what financial trading systems were. But in everything that I learned about the economy, I still wasn't able to get what I saw was the root cause. People would talk about the 1940s as the beginning of the neoliberal economic system, but no one really spoke about the 1700s and the 1600s, which is actually where the capitalist extractive economy established itself, and its relationship with colonialism and everything it did to formerly colonized countries up to the point of the early 1900s, when we got to the Industrial Revolution, and then we have Britain as it is today. And so that's also, I can refer to Decolonising Economics, where that project came from. And as Kékéli had mentioned, what is the history of our economic system, and what did it do to our geopolitics to then determine the way that we perceive geopolitics today and the issues that we are dealing with today when it comes to global poverty and inequality, and what even is inequality and why does it exist, and what is the origin story of poverty. So that inevitably led me to just fully exploring issues of power, understanding what power was, how it operated, what structural, how you put a structural lens to issues of power, And what that means to me, as someone who has the privilege of growing up in Britain, but has a history, a family history that can relate back to a colonial intervention of the British in Punjab, to actually be part of a movement that is trying to overturn global inequality. And what the question was, what inspires me into my work? So it's that purpose and responsibility of using that story to challenge much of the power dynamics that I see that are both structural but also interpersonal, and we can't do one thing without the other. But also, really, the thing that inspires me is just the incredible, the incredible sort of uncovering of what a decolonized world is. So being really inspired by matriarchal societies, queer communities, disability justice, people who are working on land justice, those who hold ancestral knowledge and ancestral practices that are resisting hundreds of years of colonial exploitation, the abolitionist movement and its roots within Black Power and anti-prisons movement. So there are just a whole bunch of incredible groups out there that are hidden from us, and I would say hidden intentionally, but are deeply inspiring to me. And the more I learn about them, I feel the closer I become to myself. And I think that that is something that is the thing that drives me.
Thank you, Guppi. That's really inspirational. Thanks for sharing your story and kind of really putting it into perspective. The next question is around, you talk about these different movements. The question is, what cultures and dynamics exist in the movement that have prevented you from being your best self as a campaigner?
This is also a great question. I see my experience, again, over the last 10 years as being kind of, this split happened at 5 years. So I mentioned sort of 2011, but the real transformation happened in around 2015 and 16, when I was working with an economic justice think tank. And the sort of first 5 years was working within mainstream organizations and trying to operate within this, what I would refer to as white dominant, cis dominant and very straight middle class setting, and trying to become into that setting to, I suppose, succeed or achieve what I was expected to succeed or achieve at, which definitely wasn't attending global poverty. It was competitive professionalism, to then, I guess, just having a real break from that, maybe from becoming a freelancer, doing much more grassroots campaigning. Going to India was a really big and significant shift for me, to then spending the last 5 years ultimately unlearning a lot of those behaviors. And I try to think about what those behaviors and cultures are quite a lot. And I think the first one I unlearn, or I'm trying to unlearn in order to become a more strategic and effective campaigner, is my embodiment of whiteness. And that looks like, I mean, my experiences of whiteness within particularly the development sector has been in the way decisions are made in campaigns. So I remember vividly being in a meeting where there was an agreement to celebrate the commitment to the aid budget. This was like way back in like 2013 or 14. Despite the fact that the budget for DFID, or the budget for the aid, was going to be also committed to like military interventions and surveillance and all these sort of terrible things, and wasn't really the kind of aid money that we wanted, or the kind of money that we want investment in, but it was going to be converted into something a lot more insidious and violent. And yet we were told, I mean, I was told as a junior campaigner that we can't talk about that complexity because we need to have a campaign win, and this is a campaign win, so this is a good thing. And like, don't bring in complex ideas. And I just feel like, whiteness shifts our understanding of what a campaign win is, because we are only thinking about the white audience that sustains the development organization, or supposedly sustains the development organization. And that's one way. The other is monoculture. So I remember speaking to a senior member of staff who still continues to have a senior role at this particular development organization. When there was a huge number of, loads of people made redundant because there was a massive global restructure. And what I noticed was pretty much 90% of the people of color who weren't based in the UK were made redundant. And his reflection on this process was, well, you know, it's difficult when I come into the office and I try to make a joke and no one laughs. And sometimes we just want to be able to have a joke with each other rather than be serious all the time. And that kind of expectation that people should like mold to your version of history, your humor, your culture, working in international development and not willing to see why someone might not find a white middle class joke funny, was pretty prevalent too. The last thing that I think is really a real description of whiteness is, I guess, how you see impact. Not how you see impact, but like how one would see impact. So viewing success in output rather than impact. And if we have been successful, and if we've been writing all of these funding reports about all the great things we have done, why is it that we are seeing continuing increasing inequality across the world, plus race and climate change and more conflict and more division? It's really fascinating that many organizations continue to write reports, blogs about how well they're doing and how much they're succeeding. And largely that is based on their assessment that output, i.e. numbers of emails that are sent out or number of people who clicked on something, let alone actually like shifted someone's brain into thinking about things differently, is a view of success. And I do remember talking to a senior member of staff and saying, in here you've written impact equals number of emails, and for me that doesn't make any sense. But this guy who is what was he? He was the head of that department, has moved on to lead multiple other agencies. You know, there is this strange kind of continuation of this practice that seems to be completely okay. And whilst someone might leave one organization, they continue that approach at a more senior level in another organization. So it's really difficult to extract them. And quickly, last two things. Middle classness. I have been brought up with the most middle class behaviors because of the way that I mentioned that my dad was brought up, as an immigrant working class kid. When we were 8, he'd take us to the opera. He would like shove culture down our throats and make sure that we got rid of our Cockney accent. You know, I have been molded into the perfect middle class being. And with that comes entitlement and an assumption that intelligence is prevalent. And I think there's something that Kékéli had mentioned about trust and trusting people's opinions on stuff. And so I think one thing that we really need to challenge with what is limiting with middle classness is we push ourselves into this very paternalistic way of thinking about people, and we are very scared of complexity when people are like dying for complex answers to these very complex problems that we have. And another response I remember from a survey that we did on the Robin Hood tax campaign was that supporters are like, you're telling us very superficial answers to very complex questions, and we want the complexity. So if people are willing to have the complexity, let's give it to them, because it is very grounding once you know exactly what's going on. And the last thing I'd say is straightness or cisness. So another way of referring to this is heteronormativity. So the assumption that everything is in binaries, you know, men marry women, and where boys and girls are born, but there is no other form of gender that a child can be born into. And that sort of rigidity is just so boring and drains us of all of our creativity, when the history of formerly colonized countries embraces queerness and embraces that kind of creative living and offers us a chance to engage in the world in a much more, again, complex way. And if we were to embody class politics, we would have much more humility. We would learn much more. And if we were to embrace a decolonial approach to thinking about my racial identity, we wouldn't even refer to race. We would talk about racialized people, because race is a social construct. And we would be much more conscious about what it means to present as certain people within the world. So I just think there are so many things, but I'll just stop there.
Thank you. That's very rich and quite enlightening. Given that everyone's results obviously quite keen to kind of understand how can we do things differently, My next question is around what groups and initiatives are doing the most inspiring work around anti-oppression campaigning?
Yeah, maybe not unfortunately, but because I got so scared off by the international development sector, I haven't done nearly enough global work as I've wanted to. A lot of it is India-based because that, like I said, where my family and partner are from. But within the UK and within Europe, there are, you know, really great groups that are worth learning from. And of course, we have a very strong and I suppose well-resourced migrant campaigning population. So the first group is my program, Working on Our Power. So we started this in 2017. Working on Our Power is the UK's first leadership training program for non-binary, trans and cis women of colour. And it sort of creates a space for, I suppose, people of colour to be able to find the skills that they need to engage in political leadership, but without having to confront whiteness and maleness in that, not having to justify their experience, but having the chance to work on themselves and build the community they need to build in order to be politically powerful. So they're going through their second phase now and doing really great work. Again, I'll speak to resourcing racial justice, which is trying to disrupt the philanthropic sector, another project that I'm involved in. But one partner to that is, and also led by wealthy white people, young wealthy white people, is Resource Justice, very similar name. They haven't got a public website at the moment, but Resource Justice are, a group of white individuals who have inherited wealth and are using their wealth for redistribution and redistribution and reparations, and as well as just giving away their personal wealth to social movements. They're also doing a lot of accountability work on themselves and their self-awareness and the way they operate and their understanding of whiteness and their understanding of capital and where it comes from. There's also some really incredible queer and trans-led liberation groups in the UK that I mean, there's just so many, and maybe worth me just sending you lists, but I think if you just search queer liberation and trans rights, there's a lot of work being done at the moment because the trans community under so much attack, and they're under attack for a reason, which is because trans people and migrants are the first testing ground for violations of human rights by the state. So it's really important for us to become allies, very strong allies to the trans community and migrant community, because if their rights are eroded, basically it means that our rights are, I mean, it's not the reason that you should do it, but it's worth knowing that that's the next step in the strategy. And we can tell that from the announcement recently about the battle that's going to come with the EU on human rights legislation. Slightly mainstream, but really good still in terms of learning. Charity So White is a great collective, do loads of writing, really worth reading. Advocacy Academy, a brilliant youth training campaigns group based in Brixton. Campaign Bootcamp, a lot of you will have heard of. Reading about their blogs and the groups that go to the training is really inspiring, and because they're so spread across the UK and so committed to disability justice and racial justice. And then again, if you look at the grantees on resourcing racial justice and Edge Fund, you'll find out a lot. So my suggestion is to follow these like smaller grassroots groups as much as you can, either through their newsletters or on Twitter, if you're on Twitter, or on their Facebook pages, because there's so much knowledge production, but it's just our role to read it and our role to absorb it, and that's really the space in which we learn the most, learn about other people's experiences, and then know what to do with ourselves in reflection of it.
Great, thank you, Guppi. That's brilliant. Really, really good resources that you've listed. I know we have another question, but that kind of opens up a whole new conversation around climate, so I suggest we kind of skip that and go to the Q&A. And there's a few questions in the chat box. Firstly, I'll go to the questions for Kékéli. I think there's one from Kathy. Where do you see the socialist ideals of equality fitting into the development history, both ideological ideologically and in practice. So we'll take a couple of questions and then I'll go for questions for Guppi in a bit.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? Because I'm looking for it. Is it in the chat box?
Yes. So where do you, let me just quickly type it out so you see it.
Do you want me to ask it?
Yeah, yes, please.
Why not just let me ask it in person?
Yes, go on.
Because I want to say it in the context of how useful and valuable I think all of the ideas that we've been getting have been. Speaking from the point of view of someone who was sent on my first sort of doing good abroad sort of thing about 40 years ago to China. And there's all the things that you've been talking about actually don't exactly follow in what I discovered when I went to China. China at that time was a desperately poor country, and the changes that have happened in China have not been through anything other than the Chinese way of dealing with it, despite my efforts at teaching English for a while. But I actually do think that there are quite, the whole thing about talking about former colonized countries doesn't exactly match, because, for example, China doesn't fit that model. And so I would quite like to see what your feeling is about the motivation which a lot of people have into development that comes from a sort of equalitarian, rights-based approach, and how that fits into the origin story.
I'm not an economist, and I'm not a specialist on Chinese history, but I wonder, at the time you went to China, I guess I am for going further back in history and wondering some of the happening in China in our contemporary era, compared to the long history of China. And China was not colonized, but the British did spend some time, I will not say meddling, but in the region. And sometimes the way society handles outside influence in that case has been to shut down. But I'm not saying that poverty or inequality is a preserve of encounter with the Western world. I think we talk about capitalism. I mean, there's various system of oppression that come and intersect. There's all sorts of conditions. We take climate, history, that mean that at a certain point, a society will be, depending on whose scale we're using, but more or less poor. That is something that I'm not negating at all. But I think we tend to forget 400 years, more or less, of quite extensive domination of a few countries over, and that influence has seeped through most parts of the world. So in some places there have been ways to there's been way to try to counter it that have, I guess, two wrongs do not make a right, as the expressions say. So I think that sometimes looking at 40, 50, even 100 years back is not enough when you're looking at our common history. So I don't know if that answers your question, but in the way, I guess, in the current understanding of development, I think it's yes, inequality, patriarchy, all of the things everywhere, all the time, but there is something that happened with, I guess, France, it's not just Britain, but France as well, and the way their way of seeing the world filtering through cultures everywhere, and with different results, but that influence is there, whether people are countering it or people embrace it altogether.
Thank you, Kékéli. I want to just go, I'm going to just skip a few questions and sort of get Guppi to respond to this. So I think it's Patrick Gorman's comment or point. I don't know, Patrick, if you want to raise it yourself, or shall I read it out loud? Patrick?
No, just go ahead and read it. It's fine.
Okay. So in order to raise awareness, a possible campaign is for results to facilitate generating a top 10 league table for those in international development institutions or agencies that offer the best long-term approach. Ideally, it should be based on a publicly announced matrix or a set of criteria to be reported annually. I think the question is, what are your thoughts on this idea?
So I'm also going to read that again. So
I've just put it at the bottom of the
Thank
chat.
you. To facilitate generating a top 10 league table. Great. So I think, so I'm a fan of frameworks and maybe not so much league tables to keep you a bit competitive, but definitely frameworks and criteria, I guess. So if this is an idea to explore, what kind of interventions or programs are genuinely, and I suppose it depends, again, what your criteria will be, genuinely thinking about a decolonizing approach, an intersectional approach, a reparations approach, where power and resources are being shifted over the long term so that communities within the Global South are no longer reliant on continual charitable investments, then I think that's great. And if there are ways in which that can be shown through the different programs that are being done, then that would be really good. My sense is that the economic, as someone who does have some economics training, the economic system and the structures around it is incredibly complex and very interconnected. So the things that will long-term sustain wealth and income equality in the countries that really need it right now, and climate protection, would be whole systems change work around trade, tax, not just the way that DFID functions or whatever the department is in now, the Foreign Commonwealth Office functions, and our aid budgets, but much larger structural changes too. So the debt system, intellectual property, that kind of thing. So I think it is good, particularly. So I thought there would be something similar to that. So there is a really good way of assessing it, and one of the most inspiring groups I know, in fact, they're a regranter called 1,000 Currents, and they work really closely with communities. They basically have partnerships, and they work really closely with community initiatives in the Global South, but they redistribute wealth that's from the US, and they are currently trying to do the same from European institutions as well. So I'd explore some of the grantees within 1,000 Currents and some of the work they're doing. They're really brilliant.
Great, thank you. The next question, I really would like both Kékéli and Guppi to have a view, and I'm just going to copy paste the question. Is by Elena Muzouris to everyone, and I see quite a few people responding to that question around privilege and kind of using that privilege in a good way, basically, and how campaigners can use the idea around privilege to be more productive. So I don't know, Elena, if you want to add to that question.
Yeah, thanks. It was more so, obviously, recognizing your own privilege is something that there's a lot on like social media and things like that, and it's definitely something we should encourage. But I know there's a lot of kind of almost stigma around it. Some people are really hesitant and quite uncomfortable with recognizing their own privilege. So how do you kind of change perception into saying, okay, recognizing your own privilege, it's not a good thing, it's not a bad, well, I mean, it is a good thing, it's not a bad thing, but it's something that we need to do in order to make progress within development. How would you say is the best way to kind of change opinion for those that find it a little bit uncomfortable?
Thank you. Yeah, Guppi, do you want to go first since you have your mic unmuted?
Yeah, I mean, this actually speaks to the first question that was asked by Kathy. And what I wanted to respond to that question, I think this might work, is, let's firstly remember who we are. So when I say who we are, like, who are you as an individual, and where are you situated and what your context is. So I think there are so many problems and there is so much complexity, but it's what drives you when you're thinking about your privilege and how you're applying it to the change that you want to see. One of the things that made me think about that when talking about the inequality that exists in other countries that weren't formerly colonized is that we are UK-based campaigners working within a UK-based organization, thinking about UK government and what its functions are. So we're thinking about British history and how Britain was responsible for colonization, and what story we tell in that context when we think about the campaigns that we're running and our relationship and engagement with other countries that we will refer to as formerly colonized, because that is where the majority of our aid budget goes to, and the majority of the kind of problems that we're trying, most programs within the development sector try to focus on. And if it's not just British formerly colonized, it would definitely be European formerly colonized. Not forgetting that, countries such as Singapore also have an inequality problem. So does Japan, and China will as well. And it's not just country by country, but also within country as well. So again, thinking about the layers. But when it comes to privilege, I think something that maybe helps is, this is going to sound a bit strange, but my general sense, and I think it's challenging for those who hold particularly white privilege, is like, what is the loss that you're experiencing? And I think that there is a loss within white communities because the story of colonialism has stolen the capacity for you to have a different story told about your people, and it's basically covered up this other history that exists, previous to the 1400s, that no one talks about anymore. I mean, if they do, because at school we only learn about the Tudors and the Stuarts, but what is it about you, and what is your loss that is driving you? Because it's often loss and grief that often drives us in our purpose. And again, I mentioned, for me, it's my grandfather, and the loss of what I saw as a deep understanding of my history and my positionality and where I came from, and the fact that 20 years of my life I didn't have that knowledge. And I think with that, you will better understand what is moving you and motivating you, so that when you do apply your privilege, you are applying it from the very core, rather than from this, I get what is referred to as performative action, to try to be the best ally possible. And if you're operating from a kind of nervous, I'm trying to be the best ally possible and I must do this, you're probably not doing the right work. So just really, I would just say, constantly having space to think about why you are who you are. And that is lifelong learning. So it's not like it's going to come tomorrow, but it is very, very important work to do.
To briefly add to what Guppi said, because she put everything in there, it's I think it's not so much about what you tell at this stage, because so much has been said about discussion about privilege, but it's about how do we model it? How do we model the idea of that we recognize our privilege? How do we behave that will inspire others to do the same thing? It's funny how the marketing language has infiltrated the sector, and there's always talk of win-win, the idea that there's always to win. And as Guppi said, no, I think it's real life is more complicated than that, and something will be lost. But then according to the law of physics, apparently everything transforms. So it's also the conversations around privilege, most people take them very personally, but in a way it's not personal, it is about the system. So it is about how do you use your privilege, your skill, your position to affect change in the greater whole. And I think one of the people were talking about imagination earlier. I think sometimes in the white world, there is a lack of imagination too. So there's the idea that Black and Brown people are coming to get what yours. No, I don't think it has anything to do with that at all. Black and Brown people just want to be, they do not want to be white. And I think there is a perception that there is a threat that we're coming for you. Absolutely not. It is about co-creation. It is about, in a way, imagining the world together rather than you trying to, when I say you, trying to coerce us or to shape us into the boxes that you have learned we belong. It's about getting out of the boxes, and it is really about that, recognizing the other's humanity, because we know, for example, Black Lives Matters, and for some people I've been talking with, it's a valid proposition, it's something that up for debate. No, it is just a statement. There's not much to, there's nothing to consider. It is that Black Lives Matters, but it doesn't mean at the expense of other lives. And it's interesting that would be the immediate thought of so many, or if Black Lives Matter, mine doesn't. I think we are trapped in that scarcity model that is not enough. Actually, no, the more we give, the more we are, the more we will be. And hopefully, if we start to understand the conversation about privilege and power in that way, and if we behave more that way, then I am hopeful. Because there was a comment about how I was painting quite a depressing picture of the sector, and I think it's we have to be honest with ourselves and not delude ourselves. Sometimes when you see figures and everything is going better, indicators are showing this, that, and the other. The reality is that people every day are dying. And I'm not saying let's just sit on our hands, but it is about how do we contribute from where we are. And as Guppi was saying, inequality is everywhere. Why are we running away there and not addressing it here? Why is that? And if we were to see the world as a whole, then our contribution might be here. So it might be the campaigning that you do in the UK to formally defeat, now I can't remember the acronym, but it is about the contribution here. So to change the structure, to change the parameters here so that people over there can have their hands free to imagine their liberation. And it's and there's a lot of imagining to be done, because it's been 400 years of living according to somebody else's rule. So it's that I don't want to dampen anybody's enthusiasm. It's really about realizing where we sit and where best can we use our position and privilege. And it might be for UK-based, Europe-based, so that includes me. My work is convincing the people around me here, rather than going over there trying to fix them.
Well, thank you. Wise words there, Kékéli and Guppi. Thank you so much for your insights, and everyone for joining in the discussion and some of the resources on the chat box as well. Really thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. I'm going to thank you, and I'm going to hand over to Della to close.
Thank you so much, Soha, and thanks so much to Kékéli and Guppi as well. It's been amazing to hear from all of you. And yeah, thanks for everyone who's still on Zoom on Sunday evening in the sun, and for all your great comments in the chat as well. Hopefully this is the start of a conversation that we need to be having more of as results, and it's not the end of the conversations we'll have on anti-oppression and anti-racism. So watch this space.